They're all on the FBI's most wanted list. Murderers, human traffickers, millionaire fraudsters, drug lords, terrorists. And this man. He's a threat to world peace and a key figure in the struggle between superpowers. His name is Li Fangwei, but he also calls himself Carl Li and uses several other aliases. There's no criminal on the list with a higher bounty, $5 million. The CIA, Mossad, the German BND, and other spy agencies have been pursuing him for decades. One US president even intervened personally, to no avail.
There still was this air of mystery around this Carl Li.
He reminded me of sort of like the Colombian drug lords, like Pablo Escobar.
I would say that in all likelihood, he is an individual who exists.
He's a hunter, focused on a particular prey. The most unscrupulous arms dealer on the planet.
My name is Aaron Arnold. I was an intelligence analyst at the FBI. The Carl Li case was the most unique case that I ever participated in. I don't really recall any cases that reached sort of this level of sophistication and intrigue.
The hunt is for a phantom, who, among other things, was able to help Iran obtain nuclear weapons, and of whom there's just a single old photograph.
This is sort of another mystery of Carl Li. Why aren't there more pictures? Why aren't there videos? It's kind of rare this day and age to be able to hide for so long without your photo being taken.
Aaron Arnold left the FBI for academia years ago, but this particular story has clung to him ever since.
It turned into, one of these cases where, after a day of trying to answer questions, you'd end up with more.
Now, many investigators, intelligence agency operatives, and diplomats have all had the same experience as Aaron Arnold. A suburb of Washington. Home to many of those responsible for planning America's wars and shaping US foreign policy. Among them, the man who was probably the first to pick up Carl Li's trail.
My name is Van Diepen. For about 14 years, I ran the office in the State Department responsible for, among other things, missile nonproliferation. Preventing the spread of WMD and missiles is among the President's highest national security priorities.
For years, he served as National Intelligence Officer for Weapons of Mass Destruction and Proliferation, and worked for the U.S. Department of State until late 2016.
So through all that time, I had some level of responsibility for dealing with the Carl Li problem.
The Carl Li problem. When U.S. intelligence agencies going about their daily business of collecting communication data first came across suspicious transactions by a Chinese businessman, no one suspected the dimensions it would eventually assume.
It would have been in the early 2000s, I think. Every day, as part of my job responsibilities, I would be reading the intelligence reporting that came in overnight. And there would have been some what we call raw intelligence reporting that would have, first mentioned the activities of Carl Li.
The U.S. government soon realized they'd picked up the trail of a serial offender, shipping material for the construction of ballistic missiles to Iran. in breach of 2006 UN Security Council sanctions on Tehran.
He was pretty active, and so, probably every week or two, something would come up, and as things came up, we would try to act on them.
Behind the scenes, they applied pressure. The Department of State shared information on Carl Lee's shipment routes with the governments of other nations, so they could take his containers out of circulation when the ship discharged its cargo.
Sometimes, something would come out of the other end of that process that you would, put into play and watch develop, and sometimes you weren't able, either because we didn't know enough or the intelligence behind it was so sensitive that we couldn't risk compromising it. You had to sort of sit back and let that one go.
And so, within a few years, Carl Lee became the trusted supplier to the Iranian weapons industry. Israel's spy agencies also stumbled upon Carl Lee at the turn of the millennium. They feared the businessmen from China could increase the range of their arch-enemy's missiles, with dramatic consequences for Israel.
It was more than 20 years ago when the Iranians came first time to North Korea asking for missiles to buy. And the North Koreans were very open towards their needs, and they say, we have here on the shelf missiles, buy as many as you want. The Iranian question was very interesting. What is the range of the missiles? And when the North Korean told them that the range is 1,000 kilometers, they say, we don't buy. If it is less than 1,300, we don't need it. And we all ran to the maps to see what the 300s will add to their capability, and it was very clear. If it is less than getting into the heart of Tel Aviv, they are not ready to buy.
A difference of 300 kilometers to potentially cause hundreds of thousands of fatalities.
It doesn't matter where you hit, you kill. It's so crowded, and you'll kill many Israelis.
Israel is regularly hit by smaller missiles. But partially due to Carl Lee's shipments, the country came within range of Iranian missiles that were at least 15 meters long, with a potential to carry nuclear warheads.
Clever technical solutions included replacing steel with aluminium, installing better steering, making the warhead smaller, and amending the stability of the aerodynamics. Suddenly, you could shoot these missiles over 1,500 kilometers, putting Israel within range.
The German Federal Intelligence Agency, the BND, British MI6, and other secret services also began homing in on Carl Lee during the 2000s. But just who is the man who could plunge the Middle East into chaos?
A lot of my colleagues have spent countless hours, digging through his marriage records, death records, legal records, to find out as much as they can about this guy.
Investigators obtained Carl Lee's passport number, a series of numbers that's like a fingerprint in China. It lasts for life and reveals one's date of birth. The 18th of September, 1972. The first two numbers indicate the province where he was born. 23 is Heilongjiang. An area in China's far northeast, directly on the border with Russia, or more precisely, Siberia. In the 70s, the Chinese called this area the Great Northern Wilderness. To this day, few foreigners stray into Heilongjiang. It's thought that Carl Lee spent his childhood here, in a place called Chahayang. At the time, it was nothing more than a small agricultural township. He was born into one of the darkest periods of Chinese history, Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. The nation was in the grip of a wave of fanaticism and violence. Children reported their own parents for speaking against Mao, thereby signing their own death warrants. Many were forced into labor in Heilongjiang, including educated young people from the cities. It's very likely that Carl Lee's parents were among the million people who drained swamps, planted fields, and made Heilongjiang what it is today, China's breadbasket.
This is
the Chinese hinterland. It's not a wealthy area. It's a place that's heavily reliant on farming in the summer, but that's completely cut off by snow in the winter. It's a long way to the nearest port. In other words, it would be relatively difficult to manufacture anything here.
To this day, Western visitors see Heilongjiang as a mysterious, lost, almost exotic place. It's where Li Fangwei spent the first years of his life. 30 years later, as Carl Lee, he was giving the world's most powerful government the runaround.
It wouldn't have been long before we decided that we needed to try to figure out a way to go to the Chinese government, because if we really wanted to stop him, we had to somehow persuade the Chinese government to do it.
Initially, the U.S. believed this approach would be successful.
And so then we would start dialoguing with the Chinese government, providing them information about Carl Lee's activities, and trying to, see if we could somehow both assist and persuade them to take action.
At the time, China's government had just changed its approach to weapons exports.
In the 80s and 90s, proliferation from China was focused mostly on exports from major state firms, firms that clearly were connected and controlled by the Chinese government, and these firms were selling complete systems to countries of concern.
Along with the Chinese economy, Beijing's influence grew. China presented itself as a responsible global power and endorsed several agreements aimed at preventing missiles and warheads from falling into the wrong hands.
China definitely has international obligations to do something. I mean, they're party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They have said that they are adhering to something called the Missile Technology Control Regime. So coming back to Carl Lee, according to that regime, China is meant to be controlling missile-related technologies of the type that Carl Lee is providing.
As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, China also supported the 2006 sanctions on Iranian nuclear activities. But Carl Lee continued to supply Tehran.
Every month, every couple months, as the information came in, we would, seek to what we call démarche the Chinese government about Lee and his activities. And so there's a very long history of U.S. démarches to the Chinese complaining about Lee and asking them to take action about Lee.
The talks were highly sensitive. CIA spies were regularly disappearing in China. Giving away too much information could endanger lives.
It's always a balance to try to figure out how much to tell to one's diplomatic counterpart about a problem that you've learned about through intelligence. The nightmare scenario is I go to a diplomatic counterpart and tell them that I know something about a terrible problem that is happening in their country and ask them to please stop it. They go home and tell their security service what I have told them, which allows them to identify the source and shoot the poor fellow. So someone has died for having done the right thing by trying to draw attention to a problem, and we no longer get that information either. And everyone thinks the problem is solved, except that it's not. It's just that my source is dead.
In the White House at the time, George W. Bush. Despite the risks, his administration repeatedly chose to share sensitive information on Carl Lee with China. In 2008, his Secretary of State stepped in personally. Condoleezza Rice instructed her diplomats at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing to ramp up the pressure. They were told to work on the Chinese government to ensure its intervention in the case. Rice sent several secret dispatches heavily incriminating Carl Lee. They were concerning the supply of machinery for missile construction and harmless-sounding substances such as aluminum and graphite.
You can build thrusters out of graphite, which reach into this tail, into the missile's exhaust gases, and change its direction, to put it simply. So the missile can use the stuff coming out of the back to steer itself.
It's thought Carl Lee also supplied Iran with a large number of gyroscopes.
A gyroscope is essentially the missile's brain, its sensory organs. It allows the missile to determine where it's moving, where it's going, how it's moving, countersteer, and stay on course.
It's these instruments that turn inaccurate projectiles into precision weapons.
It's how the missile steers itself. The gyroscope is like the missile's nervous system, its eyes and ears.
Carl Lee appeared to be supplying enough of these for an entire arsenal of missiles.
Those are fine instruments that require careful calibration. You can see in the quantities that Carl Lee has supplied. I mean, you have hundreds of accelerometers, hundreds of actuators that have been supplied. So this is not one or two pieces that Iran needs. This is something that they need for each and every missile that they're building.
In 2009, Barack Obama's Democrats moved into the White House. The new Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, pursued her predecessor's course unchanged. After just a few weeks in office, she had her diplomats deliver a message to the Chinese government. We strongly urge you to investigate these activities. Signed, Clinton.
There are certainly lots of things that he's doing that are illegal in China. From our standpoint, there's plenty of domestic legal basis for the Chinese to take action, but for whatever reason, they haven't.
My name's Adam Kaufman. I started working in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office in 1994. I was a street crime prosecutor, starting with very minor crimes, working your way up until you're handling more serious and violent crime. I then went and worked in a narcotics bureau that prosecuted international shipments, mostly coming up from Mexico and South America, truckloads of usually cocaine, sometimes heroin. After that, I found myself wondering what I should do, and I went and spoke with Mr. Morgenthau.
In 2003, Robert Morgenthau was the district attorney of Manhattan. He came from a Jewish family that had fled Germany, escaping persecution. His father was U.S. Secretary of the Treasury during World War II and creator of the Morgenthau Plan to turn Germany into an agricultural nation. After the war, he supported the fledgling state of Israel, which left its mark on Robert Morgenthau. In 1961, his friend John F. Kennedy appointed him District Attorney of New York. He went on to become one of the most influential figures in U.S. judicial history.
We had a tremendous amount of personal courage. He wasn't afraid to take on difficult cases. He suggested that I join this little bureau called Investigation Division Central. It was a bureau that sort of handled Mr. Morgenthau's interest in international markets, in the recognition of the place that Manhattan played in global finance.
With Wall Street as a close neighbor, Morgenthau set out to be more than just an attorney for Manhattan. He saw himself as a prosecutor for international crime.
Manhattan's unique because we have so much of global finance passes through Manhattan. International wire payments, international securities. So much international global business takes place within a mile of the courthouse in Manhattan.
The Morgenthau ethos was his investigators could hunt down any criminal whose money passed through Manhattan, which happened when someone in the city made a dollar transfer. That meant the long arm of Morgenthau reached into every part of the world.
And he was not afraid to flex those muscles and to impose himself into international finance where really very few district attorneys would be able to go.
One day, when the district attorney was well over 80, his path crossed Carl Lee's. Morgenthau had received a tip-off via one of his secret contacts.
It was probably around 2005. He called us into his office and he told us to buy tickets and get on a plane and head to Israel. Being told that we were going to go meet with Israeli intelligence officials, I had no idea what to expect.
When the New York investigators arrived, they'd never heard of Carl Lee. All they knew was their boss was very worried about the country his father had once supported.
He viewed Iran as a threat to Israel, but he also had a view based on terrorism. He also viewed it as a threat to New York and to the citizens of New York, you know, coming out of 9/11.
These were the years when the world found out about Iran's secret ambitions to build a nuclear bomb. For Israel, an existential threat, the reason for a highly unusual meeting.
I had never heard of a local prosecutor going to meet with foreign intelligence services. That was something that I had never heard of. You know, we're not the federal government, we weren't the CIA, we weren't anyone like that. But for Mr. Morgenthau, it was sort of business as usual. The Israelis had an extensive program, as you would expect, focusing on Iranian WMD and missile procurement.
The foreign spy agency Mossad had been watching Carl Lee for a while, but China was one of Israel's key trading partners, and the government didn't want any open conflict with Beijing. So all of a sudden, the New York prosecutors were in a room with the head of Mossad.
I remember sitting in a meeting with Meyer Dagan, and Mr. Dagan saying, we don't want intelligence to sit on a shelf. We want to act against it. And I understand that Mr. Morgenthau feels the same way. And so we want to help you make cases, if we can, that you can bring to expose what Iran is doing. And he said, we want to give you the tools, and if you can use them, we want you to.
Israel's Mossad began secretly collaborating with U.S. prosecutors in regards to a mysterious businessman in China.
They gave us some opening information, and it was about Carl Lee.
To this day, the authorities believe he's here, in one of Asia's most important port cities. It's about 1,000 kilometers to the south of Carl Lee's home, Heilongjiang, not far from the border with North Korea, a metropolis of millions that profited in the nationwide economic boom of the 1980s. At the time, the nation was opening up to the West. Thanks to him, Deng Xiaoping, Mao's successor. He set up special economic zones in China where foreign investment was possible. That's how Deng brought capitalism to China. In 1984, he also made Dalian a special economic zone. It's not possible to say precisely when Carl Lee's family ended up there. Despite meticulous research, no details of his youth exist. People that knew him didn't talk. The authorities divulged nothing, as though issued with a blanket directive to remain silent. Rumors and vague scraps of information are all we have to go on. It's thought he attended a school in Dalian named Number 24, an elite school for the children of high-ranking party officials. That would match the claim that Carl Lee's grandfather was a highly decorated colonel in the People's Liberation Army. It's also thought that Carl Lee worked intermittently for the state, but it's not known in what capacity. One thing's for sure, he made full use of Dalian's advantages. The port city is a great place to do business, legal or otherwise.
You have a lot of foreign, like US firms or European firms that have branches there, that manufacture things in China. From an opportunistic point of view, it's a great place if you want to be a proliferator, because there are a lot of places to hide.
Here in Dalian, a business was registered in the late 1990s. Its name, Limpt Economic and Trade Company. According to the Chinese company's register, Carl Lee's father, Li Guijin, had himself listed as the company's legal representative on the 4th of June, 1998. This company was the seed for Carl Lee's commercial empire.
The Israelis gave us some of the substance and content of certain emails that showed references to WMD and other materials for weapons procurement, missile production, things like that. We would work until late at night. We'd order in pizzas, beers, and just work on this thing all the time.
The prosecutors were in luck because in one particular aspect, Carl Lee had been extremely reckless.
Some of the email addresses were from US providers, Hotmail or Yahoo. Because they were in the US, there was a procedure to get access to the content of those emails from the email service providers. So we had a starting point. We had some very talented, tenacious prosecutors working on the case, and they just dug into the information. They were making connections.
What they found trumped all their findings to date. The investigators stumbled upon innumerable transactions and a seemingly impenetrable network of dummy companies.
We found so many channels of WMD proliferation, of money moving through different countries. He had a real global network. I remember that very well. This mission was so fundamental, especially when we started seeing what was in the emails themselves. It became very real.
He wrote, "We're the same company, the factory, the people. As the previous Limpt, the only difference is that the company's English name has changed to Sino Metallurgy and Minmetals Industry."
He would email people and say, well, don't worry about US sanctions. I'm just going to change the name of my company. I mean, he was brazen in the emails.
He urged his business partners into the fray. "This is very important," he wrote. "Otherwise, the money can be blocked like last time."
There were transactions between metallurgists all over the world providing material that Carl Lee would then provide to Iran. And Carl Lee had to pay for those materials in US dollars. US dollar payments almost always clear through banks in the US, and especially back in the early 2000s, most of those banks were in Manhattan. So if the wire payment said Carl Lee or Li Fangwei, then yes, the banks would have stopped them. But if the wire payment said the bright and shiny metallurgist company, then there's nothing for the US banks to see and the payment just goes through. That was the whole idea of Carl Lee in setting up all of these dummy companies. It was to fool the US banks into processing payments that otherwise would have been blocked.
Although he was hiding thousands of kilometers from Manhattan, investigators wanted Carl Lee to face trial in New York.
The legal theory we came up with was that by sending the wire payments in false names, Carl Lee caused the bank records of the Manhattan banks to have false information. And falsifying records, falsifying the records of a business, is a New York State crime. And so all of this came down to the falsifying of business records of banks in Manhattan.
After months of investigations, they indicted Carl Lee.
The Manhattan District Attorney, Robert Morgenthau, announced a 118-count indictment against a Chinese citizen.
April 7th, 2009 was the press conference that we had to announce the indictment of Carl Lee. It was the opportunity for Mr. Morgenthau to show to the world that this Chinese proliferator was sending material to Iran that was going to kill people. He wanted an indictment that said China is providing WMD to Iran. He wanted the world to sit up and take note of this.
Robert Morgenthau filed for the extradition of Carl Lee, who was 36 years old at the time.
The big question is, did the Chinese government know? After all, Chinese banks were involved in some of these transactions. Chinese companies have long been accused of using shell companies in the United States. Kitty Pilgrim, CNN, New York.
But the Chinese government appeared disinterested in the extradition attempt, and Carl Lee was cautious. It's thought he left China for business in Tehran on a direct flight. That way he wouldn't run the risk of being detained on a foreign stopover and delivered directly to the US.
And I remember seeing his name a lot in US documents and thinking, you know, who is this guy? My name is Daniel Salisbury. I'm a researcher at King's College in London, where I research proliferation and arms exports and arms embargoes.
Daniel Salisbury is a researcher at the Department of War Studies. The academics maintain good connections with Western intelligence agencies and are often interested in the same things. Their specialty is digging up information accessible to anyone, but found by few.
When you start looking at these cases, a lot of information is kind of hidden in plain sight. So we used help from some Chinese linguists and really started exploring what was out there on the internet.
The researchers used Chinese keywords to comb through commercial registers, customs, and court databases. In this way, Daniel Salisbury and his colleagues were able to shed light on Carl Lee's network of companies from their base in London.
We found that most of his businesses were linked to two addresses. So the Yuzhu Mansion appears to be a large office block in downtown Dalian. It's not quite a skyscraper, but it is quite tall, has a lot of floors. And I imagine this is the administrative part of the operation. Working with our Chinese linguists, we were able to find some pictures of the outside of the building and get a sense for what it looked like and what kind of things could go on there. You know, a lot of businesses were registered there, administrative functions, including hiring people and that kind of things.
And they made another discovery, one that totally changed their impression of Carl Lee. One of the companies they were able to attribute to him had a website, and it showed he wasn't just a dealer.
You had a lot of product listings for various different types of graphite. We actually realized that the address out of town wasn't just a business address, a warehouse or an office, but it was actually the large graphite factory. It really changed the scale of the problem in our mind. You know, it was a real kind of mind-blowing discovery. Looking at the satellite imagery, it's a pretty big place. I think online it was stating about 80,000 square meters. Well, it's quite difficult to verify exactly what's going on inside those buildings. But with a factory pumping these things out in China, it becomes a completely different kind of problem.
Following months of preparation, a fact-finding mission to China itself. In the city where investigators, spy agencies, and the London researchers believed Carl Lee was hiding. All the tracks left by the world's most wanted arms dealer converged in this city.
In Dalian sind sehr, sehr viele Firmen.
Many companies with an alleged connection to Carl Lee are registered in Dalian. We assumed that if we were going to find him anywhere, that's where he'd be.
When the pandemic began, China cut itself off from the rest of the world. The government expelled many foreign journalists and stopped issuing visas for short-term reporters. The only way of getting closer to Carl Lee for this film was to call on those who were long-term residents in China. In this case, Christoph Giesen and Matthias Bullinger, who's the cameraman. The two begin their search for a single individual in a metropolis of 7.5 million.
Was wir vor Ort halt als Aufgabe uns gesetzt haben, ist viele der Firmen.
We tasked ourselves to visit many of the companies that are or were registered there and find out what we can actually see. Who can we talk to? Who might provide us with the next set of clues in this puzzle laid out in front of us?
Da vor uns hatten. Finden wir Hinweise?
Would we find clues that would ultimately verify his existence?
Das erste Gebäude, das wir aufgesucht haben, war ein Büro.
The first building we visited was an office tower block, more or less in the center of Dalian. The King's College report mentioned it as the presumed center where a Carl Lee's empire is very likely to be based.
Sehr wahrscheinlich Carl Lees Imperium seinen Sitz hat. In
the past, Carl Lee's companies are said to have rented a whole floor there, the 25th floor of this building. So, we took the lift up there.
Was he actually there in person? Did he have bodyguards? Would he call the police? At the end of the corridor, a surprise.
In diesem Gebäude sind dann
There were 8 offices or apartments. We knocked on every single door. And no one had ever heard of the businesses registered to that building.
Hat niemand gehört.
The trail led nowhere.
Eine Spur ins Nichts.
My name's Thomas Countryman. I was a Foreign Service officer for a total of 35 years. From 1982 to 2011, I served in 5 different embassies overseas, at the United Nations, at the White House, at the Pentagon, mainly focused on issues in Eastern Europe and the Middle East.
Countryman has served several presidents over his career. When it came to U.S. foreign policy, he was viewed as an all-rounder with a keen eye for detail.
But then from 2011 to 2017, I was the United States Assistant Secretary of State for Non-Proliferation. In short, the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation has a job that we described as keeping the world's most dangerous weapons out of the hands of the world's most dangerous leaders. And in that job, one of my important tasks was to constantly raise with the Chinese government our concern about the illegal exports of high-tech material that Mr. Lee was organizing from China to Iran.
This building in Beijing's diplomatic quarter played a crucial role here, the Iranian embassy.
His usual means of contact was through the Iranian defense attaché in Beijing. The primary job of the Iranian defense attaché in Beijing is to acquire technology that is needed for Iran's military programs.
When Countryman took up his post, Carl Lee had already been doing business with Iran for a decade.
The problem was that he had become, in essence, the most valuable member of the Iranian ballistic missile team. So you can't say that his arrest would have ended the Iranian ballistic missile program, but we're convinced that it would have slowed it down significantly. I spoke about him in every conversation that I had with Chinese counterparts. We would often see each other at the same meetings in New York, in Vienna, in Geneva, but we also met in each other's capitals in Washington and Beijing.
The case put a huge strain on relations between the two superpowers.
They sort of washed their hands of it saying, hey, this isn't China, this is some guy. But on the other hand, were incredibly put out by us sanctioning Chinese entities. So they sort of tried to have it both ways. And so, you know, oftentimes the rhetoric would get a little heated when it came to, you know, them being upset about us sanctioning Chinese entities, including Carl Lee.
But why was China doing nothing? The U.S. had a hunch. They thought Carl Lee must have had powerful allies within the Chinese government.
Well, I believe it's difficult for a mid-level official in the Chinese government to stop him. If he is well-connected, if he's got lawyers, if he's got influence, that is more resources than the Chinese mid-level official, somebody like me, can use against him. What concerns us is that the officials above that level did not seem to care about this sufficiently to take some action.
After public prosecutors in New York, now the FBI, America's most powerful investigative authority, set its sights on Carl Lee.
I think that the scope and scale of his sort of operation really eclipsed any other type of case that the FBI was familiar with at the time.
The FBI assigned an entire group of investigators and analysts to work on the case of the Chinese businessmen.
I'd rather not talk about sort of the specifics of like who and how many were working on those. Like any HR personnel issues are kind of off limits with the intel stuff. It can't be in like a documentary. But Carl Lee was a major focus and something that was a priority investigation at the FBI, you know, for a number of years.
In roughly the 2014 timeframe, not only had Carl's activities, you know, continued to develop and worsen, but other options that other agencies were thinking about pursuing started to be, you know, become inviable. So, for example, there would be some agencies that would like to try to prosecute Carl Lee in the U.S. courts. And after a number of years, they sort of recognized that just wasn't going to happen.
It did become clear that we had both an obligation and an opportunity with the Chinese government to press harder to get the Chinese government to stop Mr. Lee from exporting this technology to Iran.
At the time, China was on the brink of a new era. Xi Jinping took over the reins of power in 2012. For the U.S., a chance to shine a spotlight on the matter with Carl Lee.
Included a diplomatic approach to China that emphasized, not only at my level, but at higher levels of the U.S. government,
the name has gone to President Obama. I'm also aware that President Obama mentioned that name to the Chinese, you know, specifically complained about it. Unfortunately, that did not result in any real change in Carl's activities and behavior.
The U.S. government then launched a response of unprecedented scale in the case of an arms dealer.
We had several meetings, sometimes at the State Department, sometimes at the Executive Office building next to the White House. That's part of the White House.
Spy agencies, investigating authorities, and several ministries joined forces to plan a coordinated strike.
There became sort of a Carl Lee blitz that was rolled out by the interagency. And so you saw, a U.S. criminal indictment. You saw some additional sanctions, including sanctions of new types coming out, et cetera, et cetera.
It included the legal pressure of the FBI.
So this was Carl Lee's mistake, that in his illegal transaction, he used the American financial system. And so this was the lever that the FBI, Department of Justice, had to pull, and ultimately ended up seizing almost $7 million of Carl Lee's money.
You saw, a reward for his, information leading to his capture.
The U.S. announced a $5 million bounty for information leading to his arrest, much like drugs lord El Chapo or Osama bin Laden after his attacks on 2 U.S. embassies.
If you look at sort of averages, you usually see in, a million or so. 5 is high. It's significant. It means something, right? Yeah, it's a lot of money.
The next day, the Chinese government issued its first public statement on the Carl Lee case.
中方的坚决反对美方以援引及国内法对中国的企业和个人实施单边的制裁。我们认为呢，美方的有关做法无助于问题的解决。
Beijing and Washington started openly trading blows.
We are very clear about the activities that this individual has undertaken and their threat to international stability and security, and that's why we were very clear from the State Department that we would offer a reward for information about his whereabouts that could bring him to justice.
If he's in China, what's the need to put this?
Well, as the release said, he's a fugitive right now, so I'm not going to speculate on where he might be.
On Capitol Hill, senators unleashed their fury.
So the Chinese government says they can't figure this out. They can't figure out how to shut him down, or guys like him. But the good news is they can figure out other things in China. They figured out how to arrest 5 women who belonged to a feminist organization last year. They figured out how to jail 44 journalists last year. They figured out how to put 27,000 Muslim minorities in the Uyghur region in prison last year. They could figure that out. But they can't figure out Carl Lee.
Mr. Lee has money and lawyers, and the Uyghurs and the women's NGOs and the others do not. The Chinese government has demonstrated that it has the authority and the capability to put out of business anyone that it wishes to put out of business.
And then suddenly a website appeared online about Li Fangwei, alias Carl Lee. The administrators said their aim was to spread information about him. The page included drawings of Carl Lee's face, photo montages, and articles in English, Chinese, and Arabic about his alleged complicity in the suffering of thousands of children in the Yemeni civil war, where Iranian missiles are being deployed, and about arms deals. But who's responsible for the website? It's a course project, write the administrators, who are evidently students. A lecturer gave them the idea.
I can't imagine there's too many classes out there that are teaching Carl Lee. It's a very bizarre sort of topic, a little kind of out there. And I feel like myself and my colleague probably know all the people that are teaching on Carl Lee, and they have no idea what this, who has created this site.
I'm Jeff Stein. I've been covering national security issues for about 40 years now, and that followed my own service in the Army as an Army intelligence case officer, where I began to get insights into how the clandestine mentality worked, and that's served me well over the years. I was with Newsweek for many years and the Washington Post, and now in my semi-retirement, I am the founding editor-in-chief of Spy Talk, a website that covers intelligence issues. I think I first heard about him in around early 2015. I began to hear of sanctions being applied to this fellow who we call Carl Lee, or Li Fengwei. So I began looking into it, and I found that federal officials were more than happy to brief me and let me know what was going on. And I wrote a major story for Newsweek.
The title of his article, How China Helped Iran Go Nuclear. It shared a number of details from intelligence agency sources.
He liked luxury cars, but I was told also that he was sort of a stay-at-home guy. He didn't go far from Dalian. We didn't learn a lot more about him except that we did have a stringer go there and do some reporting on him to locate his offices and his home. So we knew he was there. We knew he existed. But we couldn't gather any more information on him. Then came the Trump administration.
I'm angry when China's making $500 billion a year and sucking our jobs and sucking our money out of our country, and we don't do anything about it.
The Trump administration was on a campaign to blame China for everything. And as part of that, some White House officials summoned me to come down to the White House and discuss the case of Li Fengwei, and that was in 2018. And certainly, the Trump White House well knew my feelings about its foreign policy, which were negative. And I often had testy exchanges with White House spokespeople when I called them for a comment on something. So that they reached out to me to talk about this case and invite me down to the White House or the adjacent old executive office building to talk was quite unusual. I mean, I was very amused by that. But we were on the same page with that issue with Li Fengwei.
While the White House launched a Carl Lee PR offensive, the threat posed by Iranian missiles was thrust into sharp focus. In late 2017, Trump's UN ambassador briefed the media, standing in front of the wreckage of a ballistic missile fired on Saudi Arabia by Iran's allies in Yemen.
The missile's intended target was the civilian airport in Riyadh, through which tens of thousands of passengers travel each day. Just imagine if this missile had been launched at Dulles Airport or JFK, or the airports in Paris, London, or Berlin. That's what we're talking about here. That's what Iran is actively supporting. On your wall.
Initially, many wondered whether the U.S. was once again telling the same old story, just as they had done before the Iraq War, presenting alleged evidence of Saddam Hussein's WMD program. But the experts were certain.
The missile and its configuration was precisely what we know from Iran, what Iran had very proudly unveiled a few years ago in several videos and presentations.
One of the pieces of wreckage betrayed some information, the logo of a certain Iranian arms company, one of Carl Lee's most important clients. The attack on Riyadh marked the start of a whole series of strikes, which continue to this day.
We see them using those missiles. We've seen them using them in Iraq. We've seen them using them in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, where they've had significant impact. We see also Iran proliferating these missiles across the region. So, for example, Lebanese Hezbollah is the most popular proxy, most popular customer of Iranian missiles, but also now the Houthis in Yemen have been using, to a really significant extent, Iranian missiles.
And when Iran and the US edged close to war, Iranian missiles were a significant factor.
The one attack that stood out in recent years was the Iranian attack on the Iraqi bases hosting US forces in January 2020. Iran had launched a dozen missiles targeting these sites. It was extremely dangerous. It did result in over 100 traumatic brain injuries among US service members. Had this strike resulted in US fatalities, we would have seen a much more significant US response than really we had seen in past years. And I don't know how far the escalation spiral would go down.
One thing is certain. Without Carl Lee's help, Iran's ballistic missile program wouldn't be where it is today. But what's the Chinese government saying? The chance of finding an answer is highest outside of China. The Munich Security Conference, an annual gathering for leaders and state ministers, military officials, and spy agency chiefs from all over the world. In February 2020, the guest list included one of China's highest-ranking politicians. Foreign Minister Wang Yi, whose ministry had been negotiating with the US over Carl Lee for 2 decades.
How are you? Thank you so much for being here. Jean-Yves Le Drian is around, a friend, my Minister of Foreign Affairs.
During their time in Munich, Wang Yi and other guests from less democratic nations had to endure something that would never be allowed back home. Uncomfortable questions from reporters.
That's the question, yeah. The question is, why don't you stop Mr. Li Fangwei, also known as Kai Li? He's on the FBI most wanted list.
It's
a groundless charge. The Chinese foreign minister's response.
China doesn't admit, of course, providing any missile-related materials or components to Iran. So it's a little bit hard to have hard evidence here. My own suspicion is that they find themselves to have something of a coincidence of interest in that trade.
Carl Lee's businesses align with Xi Jinping's strategy. He views his nation as the second remaining superpower, soon to outstrip the US economically and militarily. Chinese strategists believe a strong Iran would benefit China in this regard.
To complicate US strategy in the Middle East, perhaps encourage Western governments to become more distracted by Middle Eastern problems and less worried about what might be happening in the Indo-Pacific that China might be behind. So that's very convenient for them.
For example, in case China decides to carry out its threats one day, if military maneuvers turn into war and the People's Liberation Army launches an invasion of Taiwan. But just where is the man who's become a key figure in the struggle of the superpowers of the past years and decades? The reporter team in China is on its way to one of the most crucial companies in Carl Lee's network, the Dalian Kharat industry. The business is registered to this building.
It wasn't an office. It was just a regular Chinese compound.
The company really does exist. There's documented evidence of its exports. It even won a court case against a supplier who was in breach of contract. But the door is opened by an old woman holding a knife. She's been chopping vegetables.
Als wir die Frau fragten, wo sie denn herkäme, sagte sie Heilongjiang.
When we asked the woman where she came from, she said Heilongjiang. And when we asked which region exactly and mentioned the name Chahayang, she said, yes, that's precisely where she came from.
Chahayang, the small agricultural township where Carl Lee is thought to have spent his childhood. More than 1,000 kilometers from Dalian.
Now that's a very, very remarkable situation, to find someone in another province that comes from precisely this place with around 10,000 inhabitants.
How is she connected to Carl Lee? Did she just let him use her address? Maybe she's known him since he was a child, from their homeland in the far north.
When we asked about Carl Lee, her response was that she didn't know how to contact him. Then, relatively quickly, she referred to her age, telling us she was over 80, and that it was our job to find him.
To this day, this apartment here is the official HQ of Dalian Karat Industry. At least that's what it says in the Chinese company's register. In this story, every answer leads to even more mysteries, such as the question of who's behind the website Who is Li Fangwei? One thing we do know, the administrators don't want anyone to know who they are. They've opted for an anonymous domain registration. The content of the site is increasingly strange and elaborate. The message of this comic is, the unscrupulous and profit-hungry arms dealer Carl Lee has nothing to fear from investigators and prosecutors, because he can always hide behind the Chinese state.
It's incredible, right? I don't think we've ever seen that kind of thing done with a proliferator either. I mean, it looks fairly sophisticated and well thought out. It seems like someone has put some resources into this. And I get a sense reading it as well, and having seen various Chinese comics that the Chinese government has used to talk to people about national security issues in China, it looks like someone has seen those and thought, okay, this maybe is a good way to talk to a Chinese audience.
And then suddenly, a possible lead to the website creators does crop up on this Facebook profile. The owner of the profile seems to be studying international security in Germany and admits that the Who is Li Fangwei website is theirs. They are evidently studying in Heidelberg. In any case, they liked many sites connected to the university there and Heidelberg student life. The strange thing is, at Heidelberg University, no one's heard of a student called Zhang Zhengbo, never mind an internet site or study project about a Chinese arms dealer. Neither relevant professors nor student representatives.
Through our analysis of bank records and our analysis of emails, we saw that he was doing a lot of business in euros. We did see that a lot of those payments cleared through Frankfurt. And so we decided that we would go try to encourage the Germans to take an action similar to what we had done. So we went over to Germany. We had put together a book, a dossier of the euro payments that we had knowledge of. So we were showing the originating bank, the parties, the dates, and the banks that were processing the payments through Europe. and specifically the German banks that were clearing the payments. And we went over to Bonn, and we met with a woman, a federal prosecutor in charge of sanctions enforcement in Germany, and we met with a team of investigators from the federal police, and we presented our information to them. We had a good meeting. They asked the right questions. They were clearly thinking about it. And then the sort of team of police investigators took us out for dinner and beers. We had a nice German dinner. We had, I think, as I recall, bratwurst, bunch of beers. And then, and then they excused themselves, and I think my colleagues and I stayed out a little bit longer, as we might. From our perspective, nothing ever came of it. There was never sort of a similar prosecution of Carl Lee. That never happened.
There's one more lead on the ominous website to an Arab Facebook group linked to the site. Its administrator's name, Karim Mostafa. It looks like they're also studying in Germany and living in Berlin. Strikingly, the profile is structured precisely like that of Zhang Zhengbo. Both have nondescript profile images with glasses and a book. And both were first active on Facebook within 2 days of each other. Something else they have in common, they're both untraceable. These apparent students aren't registered with authorities in Berlin or Heidelberg. It's as though they don't really exist at all.
The fact that these people are ghosts and basically don't exist would fit with a theory of this being run by a state.
It leads us to think that, perhaps this is a government operation. It may be a government operation to try to sort of get the word out about Carl Lee.
Especially in states that spend a lot on intelligence and have, many thousands of people working in this area, it's quite possible that there's someone in an office somewhere whose job it is to run these kinds of operations, maybe against Carl Lee, but also against other narco-traffickers or other non-state threats as well.
So the site could be the work of spy agency personnel?
It's quite possible that people making those videos know something about him and have a good sense of how he might react to something like that. And, it's obviously a very targeted thing to do.
In spy speak, information operations, or I.O.
There's also sort of maybe also a name and shame sort of component, maybe get under his skin a little bit. The idea of, you ever heard of like tickling the wire, right? So, maybe sort of doing something to cause a reaction, right? That you can perhaps monitor better or enhance your own information by doing that.
Just to sort of think, okay, maybe government taxpayers' dollars somewhere are going into the making of these farting pig videos, is really something strange to see.
Of all the possibilities, two nations stand out.
Probably the countries that seem to have had the biggest interest in Carl Lee. So that would be the US or probably Israel.
Israel would be the most plausible. The nation's intelligence services are known for unconventional cyber operations, and no country faces a greater threat from Iranian missiles. A threat that's continued to grow over recent years, also because of the activities of Carl Lee. This is particularly evident in the north, in the Golan Heights. Israel captured this territory from Syria in 1967 and has occupied it ever since. The Rocky Plateau is of strategic importance for Israel to monitor one of their bitterest enemies, Hezbollah, which holds positions to the north of here in Lebanon. Army spokesperson Jonathan Conricus was stationed here for a long time.
What you see behind us is really, think of it as a highway, as a smuggling highway for Iran, by which Iran transfers missiles, component, infrastructure, machinery to produce or to convert. All of that is transported from Iran, Iraq, via Syria, and the very areas that you can see close to the Syrian-Lebanese border.
For years now, Iran has been trying to supply its Hezbollah allies in Lebanon with precision missiles. Based on what we know, Carl Lee's businesses have been instrumental in the development of these very same projectiles.
What Hezbollah will try to use their precision-guided missiles for the most sensitive and high-value targets, like our port, our airport, government facilities, hazardous materials.
The entire nation became aware of the existential nature of this threat in connection with the port city of Haifa, where thousands of tons of ammonia were stored. If the chemical were to be released somehow, that would potentially risk hundreds of thousands of lives, something the leader of Hezbollah knew only too well.
Hassan Nasrallah has said, without any shame, yes, I will aim for the ammonium container in Haifa. I will try to strike it, and I will try to kill as many civilians as possible.
مملة نووية بمعنى كم صاروخ من عنا زائد هول حاويات الأمونيا بحيفا نتيجة قنبلة نووية.
So that's the meaning of the enemy that we're dealing with.
The ammonia vat in Haifa was emptied following this threat from the leader of Hezbollah. But there are other chemical plants in Israel that could be a target for Iranian precision-guided missiles. Also because for years, Carl Lee supplied navigation instruments to Tehran. And all Western spy agencies could do was look on powerlessly from the sidelines.
The officials, I remember, were very angry. Maybe that was just a Trump motif, because they were always angry about China, blaming China for this and that. They were on a campaign against China. So I wrote the story.
In 2019, Jeff Stein published an article in Newsweek on new Donald Trump sanctions against Carl Lee and on the authorities' cold fury with the Chinese government.
They said to me, this is just the start, these new sanctions. We're going to do more. We're going to really teach China a lesson with Li Fangwei.
At about the same time, a member of the Trump administration began denouncing Li Fangwei alias Carl Lee and China's government on Twitter. It was the Assistant Secretary of State at the time, Christopher Ford.
Li Fangwei was for a long time perhaps the most notorious of the proliferation traffickers in China. And nothing ultimately was done. It continued to be a problem for a very long time. When I was in government, we stepped up that pressure on China, trying to get them to pay more attention to it.
The Trump administration started ramping up the pressure on both China and Iran at the same time. The latter country was the responsibility of Brian Hook, a hardliner and close presidential confidant. He was U.S. Special Representative for Iran at the time.
The Iranian regime has been chanting death to America. Iran has been very successful at its mission to try to terrorize the Middle East. It is a corrupt religious mafia that has really impoverished its own people in order to fund an ideology that they export around the world. What is different about this administration's approach is that we are putting in place a pressure campaign that doesn't have any historic precedent.
But strangely, Brian Hook remained tight-lipped over the man who was probably the most crucial foreign supplier to the Iranian missile program.
I don't have any comment on Carl Lee. I don't have any new information to share with you on that.
It was mid-2019 when all of a sudden, silence fell over Washington.
Well, we haven't heard anything since then. So, what's going on?
Assistant Secretary of State Christopher Ford also suddenly stopped commenting on Carl Lee.
we decided to stop tweeting. That's about all I can say.
Okay.
That's not helpful, I understand.
The silence was deafening, as they say. It's a mystery to me. And then I, tracked these same officials a couple of years later. Every once in a while I would call and say, "Yeah, what's going on?" Well, they're not talking about it. Officials are reticent to talk about him at all, or they have memory loss. They suddenly can't remember. I have to remind them. Carl Lee, the Chinese? Oh, that guy. So they're not talking about Carl Lee. Carl Lee may not even be on their mind at all. And if he is on their mind, they're not making it public what they're doing.
And then the website Who is Li Fangwei went offline. What's happened to Carl Lee? On the investigative trail in China, the team travels northwards from Dalian. It's thought that Carl Lee's graphite factory is located 100 kilometers from the port town. This, according to information unearthed by researchers at King's College in London. The factory that distinguishes Carl Lee from many others in his particular line of work. The one that makes him both a trader and a manufacturer. Welcome reads the word on the chimney, and the name of the company, Sinotech Carbon. The company has existed since 2006. A quarter of the shares belong to Carl Lee, and the rest belong to his younger brother, Li Fangdong.
The question was, of course, is it an industrial ruin now? Is there anything left of it? Or are graphite products still being actively produced there?
A question that can only be answered in close quarters.
When you approach the building, it almost feels like an industrial ruin, a complex where you get the sense that nothing's happening there anymore. But then you spot areas with the latest surveillance technology, loads of cameras watching anyone approaching the site of the factory.
The investigation could be brought to an abrupt end at any moment, but instead, the opposite happens.
You can easily enter the plant grounds. The gates are open. Interestingly, there was no one there to speak to at the time.
On the site of a factory owned by one of the world's most wanted men. And indeed, there are tons of graphite here. The material so urgently needed by Iranian missile engineers and supplied to them in huge volumes by Carl Lee.
It seems dilapidated, but it's not the case that there's no longer anything there. Production is clearly going on in one section of the industrial site.
Wenn man sich ansieht, dass der als der gefährlichste Waffen.
Considering this is supposed to be the most dangerous arms dealer in the world, the FBI has put a $5 million bounty on this man. And suddenly you arrive at what's supposed to be the hub of his entire empire and you think, wow, so this is the most dangerous guy? And here it looks like we're out in the middle of nowhere. Then you do start to wonder, does all this really add up?
Passt das alles hier so zusammen?
The two men still have two cards up their sleeve. Two telephone numbers from Carl Lee's closest circle. So as not to jeopardize the filming, they make the calls after the factory visit.
Li Fangdong ist der jüngere Bruder von Li Fangwei.
Li Fangdong is the younger brother of Li Fangwei. That was really quite a remarkable telephone call, because he just confirmed many details for us. He said, yes, they did business with Iran in the past, but that they no longer do. A second thing he said was that the factory is still active, and that products are still being manufactured there. So he confirmed what we saw on the site, and said that unfortunately, we wouldn't be able to meet his brother.
Dann haben wir eine andere Nummer angerufen.
Then we called another number.
Sich als Li Fangchun vor.
There had been speculation, primarily in the King's College research report, that this could lead us to the older brother of the family.
Gemutmaßt, dass das der ältere Bruder der Familie sein könnte.
When we asked him about Li Fangwei, alias Carl Li, he said he couldn't reach him himself at the moment.
Where is Carl Li? And why is no one in Washington talking about him anymore?
At the beginning of the Biden administration, I made some sort of gentle inquiries about Carl Li, and zero, zip, nada, silence. You know, I'm a former intelligence case officer. I've been covering the CIA and other intelligence agencies for years. So I wondered, well, maybe we doubled Li Fangwei. Maybe he's our guy now.
Carl Li, a double agent betraying his own business partners to the enemy? It's a bold theory, but there certainly have been such cases in the past.
I mean, I have no evidence of that whatsoever, but that's the way my mind works. I mean, I couldn't find any other logical explanation why the U.S. would suddenly go silent about Li Fangwei. But he wouldn't have a very long life in China. I mean, CIA's operations in China, from public reporting, we know, have been a disaster. There were security lapses allowed dozens of CIA sources in China to be rolled up and thrown in jail or executed, so.
And then a new lead appears, online for 31 minutes. In the Chinese edition of Wikipedia, in the article on Li Fangwei. The version history reads, on the 8th of January at 2021 at 6:58 a.m., an anonymous user added the following passage. In April 2019, Li Fangwei was detained by the police on suspicion of smuggling goods and articles banned from import and export by the state. In late 2020, Li was held in pre-trial detention in the city of Dalian. At 7:29 a.m., the passage was removed by the same user. The reason provided, that the information had not come from a reliable source. Is that the answer? That he's in prison? But then why is the FBI still trying to track him down with a $5 million bounty? There's still one address to check out, the last on the list. The headquarters of a company 60% of which is still owned by Carl Li personally.
In this garbage-filled compound, there's a company that's still active.
It's called Dalian Trust Industry and has made millions in sales. Official customs data show that components for nuclear reactors have been exported from here.
Als wir da dann geklingelt haben,
when we first rang the bell, no one came to the door. So we checked with the house next door to make sure we got the right address. And they said, yes, that's correct. But we should go around the back, as the neighbor might be in the garden.
Could it be right here? The answer to everyone's questions.
We went around the back and asked about Carl Li. We're looking for a man named Li Fangwei. Do you know him?
I may have heard of Li Fangwei. Isn't he in prison?
Where? What do you mean he's in prison? Is he in trouble?
Yes. He was jailed for a few things. You know what I mean. I think he's in prison.
And suddenly he asked why we wanted to know. And a short time later, our conversation with him was over. Visiting the supposed office addresses of Carl Lee's companies in Dalian, you get a sense that everything's totally off. Yes, these are private addresses. These people are private individuals, pensioners. None of them are running any businesses. They probably have no idea exactly what's being done in their name.
Sehr wahrscheinlich gar nicht wissen, was genau in ihrem Namen dort angestellt wird.
It sounds like the perfect cover. A defensive shield of the unsuspecting. A labyrinth that swallows up anyone trying to get near. To Li Fangwei, to Carl Lee, to Patrick, David, or Charles, to Sunny Bai, or Song Dahai, whatever he calls himself. But could the neighbor still be right? That the 50-year-old is now in jail because after 2 decades, the Chinese government took him out of commission. If anyone would know that, it's Christopher Ford, the senior official who suddenly stopped condemning Carl Lee and the Chinese government on Twitter.
Was one of the reasons that he might have been arrested at that point in time, that you stopped tweeting?
As I say, I'm not in a position to talk about any specifics with respect to Carl Lee.
Christopher Ford doesn't give a specific answer because recent developments in the Carl Lee saga are classified, but his words do hint at something.
I always sort of suspected, as we drew attention to Carl Lee, if we were lucky, they would actually stop some of the network. If we were less lucky, they might still do something to him in a way that would undercut our criticism and allow them to say that this is not a problem and have us be unable to contradict them.
In the past, the U.S. government would often secure concessions from Beijing whenever the two nations discussed trade. And indeed, during the period in question, Chinese head of state Xi Jinping called on Donald Trump to avert the imposition of new heavy goods tariffs. Beijing did make some concessions at the time, with indications that the arrest of Li Fangwei might have been one of them. But even if that's true, has the problem been solved? Is the world a slightly safer place?
For a long, long time, Li Fangwei was sort of the, as we say, the poster child for the proliferation problem. But I should say, if Li Fangwei were hit by a meteorite tomorrow, the proliferation problem would not evaporate. These are fairly well-established institutions that appear to have some degree of official, at least protection and perhaps permission to do this.
It's thought his network continues to be active, with or without him.
This is a very kind of murky area, and it's something that we may hear about later, or you may never hear about it, even when the archives are opened in 30, 40 years' time.
This is kind of just the typical Carl Lee story, right? It's just kind of more strange weirdness day after day.
A last-ditch attempt. Another call to the younger brother's number. Where is Carl Lee?
The number you have dialed is not in service. The number you have dialed is not in service.